So precedents, he's the first president, so things he does are going to kind of set the standard for presidents to come. And we're going to touch like more in depth about these different things as we go through tonight. But he's going to be the first president to create a cabinet. And we're going to talk about in the next slide, actually, the first cabinet positions he created, how many cabinet positions he had in comparison to how many we have today, and what exactly is the purpose of the cabinet, and how and where did he get the power to create it. So we'll talk about that precedent, but just know he was the first one to create a cabinet, and all presidents since then have done the same thing. We're going to talk about the fact that he was a two-term president. Easily, he could have run for a third term and won re-election. He was super popular both his first and second term. He decided to step down, kind of setting that precedent that, right, there's still that fear of they don't want a king again, so it's important after so many years to step down. He did that, and when he stepped down and he retired, he literally kind of got out of the public eye. He wasn't like hanging around to see how Adams was going to do in his as second president. He really got out of the public eye and retired and went back to Mount Vernon. And we're going to see all presidents in the beginning follow that two-term precedent until we get to FDR, who's going to serve 4 terms. And that's at that point, that's when we're going to get a constitutional amendment limiting presidential terms. But in the beginning, we didn't have that amendment. George Washington kind of just decided on his own to step down. And then we'll get into his farewell address. Probably one of the most popular farewell addresses of all time, not at the time that it was written, but now as history dorks, love to look at his farewell address because there was so much in it, so much that he was trying to tell the country and where it was going and fears that he had about where our country might go. And he was somewhat prophetic in some of the stuff that he said, and we're going to talk all about that. So let's start off by talking about President Washington's first cabinet. So today, currently in our cabinet, we have 16 cabinet positions. At this point in time, though, you can see that George Washington only has 4 cabinet members. And through the years, as our country develops and we kind of see that more is needed, more executive departments, because that's what the cabinet is, it's an executive department, we're going to see that presidents will kind of add on new departments. So the latest one would be right after September 11th, our country added the Department of Homeland Security. So that wasn't there prior to September 11th. So even today, we're seeing new cabinet positions get added. Important to understand, the cabinet is not mandated by the Constitution, but basically what our Constitution does say is that the president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So basically what we have here are executive departments being created. And then George Washington, what he does is he appoints a head to each executive department, and then he calls upon them to give him advice related to their specific topic. George Washington, when he's choosing his first cabinet, he makes sure to include members from various parts of the country. So he makes sure he has members who are coming from the West. And remember, at this point in time, the West, we're not talking about the West of our country today. He makes sure to have cabinet members coming from New England, from the South, from the Mid-Atlantic. He wants to make sure he's getting snippets from each part of the country. There are no political parties when George Washington becomes president. He's not a member of a political party. Today, it's customary sometimes that presidents will sometimes try to choose cabinet members and try to get different parties within those cabinets. We haven't seen it so much lately, but a lot of times past presidents have made sure to have both Democrats and Republicans on their cabinet. So George Washington was making sure to have different parts of the country because that's what was really important back during that time period. George Washington, his very first cabinet nomination will be the famous Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. And the way it works is the president nominates, and then Congress, the Senate, needs to approve those nominations. In total, we'll have Secretary of State being Thomas Jefferson, Treasury, which I just mentioned, being Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War, Henry Knox. We tend to refer to the Secretary of War today as the Secretary of Defense. And then the Attorney General will be Edmund Randolph. The way it became known, and this is just kind of an aside, fun fact that you might hear on Jeopardy sometime, not something you would necessarily see on your APUSH exam, but it's actually James Madison who gives the nickname the President's Cabinet. It's just a reference he's making to these men who are meeting with the president to advise the president. And so James Madison, in a sense, comes up with that nickname. Washington, not only does he create these positions, but in a sense, he's basically setting a precedent too for the roles that these positions would play, the way that they would have to communicate and interact with the president. And so we see from George Washington that these folks who are serving on the cabinet are really going to become trusted advisors of the president. And we're going to see that as we move forward. Get excited for probably a month or so from now when you get to learn about Andrew Jackson and his cabinet, because he takes a little bit of a different approach. Just something for you to get excited for as you go through American history. What's going to be interesting, though, about this cabinet specifically, like I said in the beginning, there are no political parties. We are going to start to see the emergence of two political parties, though, which is why we have a two-party system today. And it's going to come from Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who have some very differing viewpoints. And when we talk about some of the issues that took place during Washington's presidency, we'll delve more into those viewpoints. But we'll see that that actually ends up creating a lot of tension on the cabinet, to the point that Jefferson at one point is going to check it out and be like, see ya, I'm not going to be involved anymore. But a big thing will be the national bank that will be proposed by Hamilton. That will end up being a big sour point for Jefferson. So as we move into Washington's domestic policy, one of the very first things that we see Congress do is pass what's known as the Judiciary Act of 1789. According to Article 3 of our Constitution, it talks about setting up a Supreme Court system and that there will be a Supreme Court. But basically, it gives the power to Congress to decide how many people are going to be on that Supreme Court, what's it going to look like. And it also gives Congress the power to create all the lower courts underneath the Supreme Court. And that's exactly what Congress is going to do with the Judiciary Act of 1789. And knowing how a bill becomes law, it's going to be George Washington who's going to sign that law into effect. With this Judiciary Act of 1789, we see that there's going to be one Chief Justice and 5 associate justices. So it's smaller. There's only 6 people on the Supreme Court, which is smaller than the 9 people we have on the Supreme Court today. And through history, you'll see when that changes. Our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Jay. You might recall him as being one of those gentlemen who helped to write those Federalist Papers. In total, because remember, this act is creating all the federal courts that are going to be underneath the Supreme Court. So when you think of the Court of Appeals and all the different ones, right, you don't just go straight to the Supreme Court. You have to hit other federal courts. Because they're creating all these courts and Washington's the first president, he has to fill all those positions. So in total, amongst all the federal courts, and this is including those 6 folks we just talked about from the Supreme Court, he's going to appoint 38 federal judges in total. It's not a lot when you think of how immense our federal court system is today, but keep in mind, we weren't as big of a country, state-wise, population-wise, as we are today. So you'll see, again, there's going to be more federal courts created as time goes on and our country gets much larger. Bill of Rights, this is one of those things that came about over the ratification of the Constitution. So when the Constitution was being ratified, there were 2 groups of Federalists, which were like Hamilton, Jay, Madison, who wanted to see that Constitution ratified. And then you had Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, who were the anti-Federalists, who were like, we're a little bit scared about making too strong of a central government. And so those anti-Federalists, prior to the ratification of the Constitution, kept calling for a Bill of Rights. And so there was this kind of compromise met, get your states to ratify the Constitution. The first thing we do, we're going to make sure under this new government to add a Bill of Rights. And so that's what's going to happen. We're going to see the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. We're going to see those Bill of Rights get added. And so that's also going to fall during Washington's presidency. Hamilton's financial plan. So Hamilton, he's the Secretary of Treasury. Our country's in immense debt after the Revolutionary War. We have to get our economy going so we can survive. And so it's kind of laid at Hamilton's hands, like, dude, figure out what we're going to do. And so he comes up with a financial plan. I'm not going to jump into it too much tonight. There's 3 big parts to it. And the reason I'm not going to jump into it too much tonight is because next Thursday I have a whole presentation on Hamilton's financial plan where we get into the nitty-gritty of those 3 parts. But just know that the things that Hamilton proposes, in short, he's going to propose import taxes, so making sure goods coming into our country are taxed. He's going to propose what's known as an excise tax, which is a tax on a specific item. So specifically, one of the things they're going to tax is going to be whiskey, and we're going to talk about that. Number 4, you can see we're heading that way with the Whiskey Rebellion. He's going to talk about internal improvements for our country. So making sure that we're kind of building communication channels within our country. That's going to be super important that Hamilton's going to want to mention. And all these different things that Hamilton is going to, and a national bank, which is like a big thing because it's going to lead to huge fights. But all 3 points that he tries to bring up, we're going to see that he's going to get into arguments with Thomas Jefferson over them. Thomas Jefferson, he's from Virginia. He's Secretary of State, but he's still got those Southern roots. And the South doesn't like much of Hamilton's plan. Hamilton, who's from New England, they love his plan. And so we're going to see that's going to cause a lot of conflict between the two. And it's also going to end up leading to conflict between Jefferson and Washington, because Washington basically signs off on all of Hamilton's ideas. And that's going to lead to some tension there as well. But again, we're going to jump into all those plans next Thursday night. So definitely check that out if you want to learn the specifics of Hamilton's financial plan. As far as the whiskey tax. So as I said, one part of his, yeah, very good, Ashley. That's exactly right. That's known as the assumption plan. That's part 1 of his plan. The fact that he wanted to take on all the different state debts that they had and have the federal government pay it off. And it was important to him to do that because 1, he wanted to establish good credit for our federal government, and what better way to do that than paying off debt. But 2, it was really important to kind of bring the states together and have them working towards this common goal of paying off that debt. And you'll see the South, because they weren't in as much debt after the Revolution as the North, were completely against that. So, yep, that's very good, Ashley. That's part 1 of his financial plan. So, also part 1 of his financial plan is this excise tax. So, this tax is going to end up being put onto whiskey. So, again, excise tax is a very specific tax, meaning you're placing it on a specific item. And so they decided at this point in time, let's put the tax on whiskey. It's a great way to raise revenue. We have to pay off our debt, right? And so we need to find ways to make money. So Western Pennsylvania tended to be the place where they made most of the whiskey. And so when they heard news of this tax coming their way, they immediately started saying that they were upset, and they started refusing to pay the tax. The folks of Western Pennsylvania really saw this tax as an unfair policy. They felt as though the Eastern folks were much more elite than them, and that they were negatively hurting those folks who were living on the frontier. And this is something we see going all the way back to Shays' Rebellion and some of the other things that have been taking place in our country. There's this tension between the East people living on the East Coast and then the people who are living in the frontier, so like Western Pennsylvania. There is a rising tension between the two of them. So Western farmers in Pennsylvania, they really feel as though this tax is an abuse of the federal government, that they're kind of targeting them as a demographic group. And so what they wanted to do was get rid of the tax. And keep in mind that one of the reasons that these Western farmers were distilling whiskey and creating whiskey was because it was actually cheaper for them to distill their grain that they were growing in Western Pennsylvania into liquor in order to ship it and preserve it. And so that's one of the reasons they were actually making whiskey to begin with. So Washington, he wants to try to end this peacefully. He has, he's thinking back to what took place with Shays' Rebellion and the fact under the Articles of Confederation with Shays' Rebellion, our federal government couldn't do anything to stop that rebellion. and he wanted to make sure that doesn't happen. So what he does is he issues a national proclamation, basically telling Westerners, you have to stop your resistance. This is a law of the United States. You're responsible for following the laws. And what we're going to end up seeing is the Western farmers don't listen. The protests are now they're still not paying the tax, but now they're beginning to protest, and these protests are beginning to become violent. And so Washington feels as though he has no choice, and Hamilton kind of said, this is the direction you have to go. So Washington calls on the militia to basically go into Pennsylvania, to the Pittsburgh area, to put an end to this rebellion and these protests that are taking place. No bloodshed or anything like that happens with the militia. Basically, once the militia starts going and people get wind of the fact that the militia is coming, things begin to settle down. There are some people who are arrested for this, and some who are actually even convicted of treason for this rebellion, but Washington ends up pardoning them, which is the power of the presidency. But it's super important, the Whiskey Rebellion, in the sense that this shows us the strength of our federal government, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, we wouldn't have been able to stop this. We couldn't stop Shays' Rebellion. Well, here we have a similar situation, but because of our Constitution, we are able to stop this rebellion, and our country is able to survive. And this is really one of the first big challenges that our country is going to have. So it's really huge that we are able to survive this challenge. But again, the sending of the militia is going to completely upset Jefferson. He is not happy at all that the militia was sent, which was, again, Hamilton's idea. And so that's going to leave him very at odds with not only Hamilton, but also with Washington as well. All right, so we're moving on now to Native Americans. And I see that and I apologize for that, I'm blocking, my screen of me is blocking some of these things about Native Americans that are coming up. But Native Americans, our relationship with them after the American Revolution is tense. Now that we have beat the British, Americans at this point in time are starting to push further and further west. This is causing collisions with Native Americans, especially this new area of the Ohio River Valley that we gained from that peace treaty of Paris in 1783, right? So now we see a lot of Americans moving into Ohio. What we know today is like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They're trying to settle out in that area. All that land that the Northwest Ordinance takes care of in 1787. And so we see these clashes taking place with Native Americans. So when George Washington becomes president, right from the get-go, he says that he wants to have a just Native American policy, that was actually one of his highest priorities, to settle these problems that we were having with Native Americans. And so what he does is he kind of puts his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, in charge of this. And Henry Knox comes out and makes a really interesting statement saying that, we needed to work better with Native Americans. He actually felt as though the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation at times were inciting Native Americans and not trying to peacefully negotiate and work with them. So Washington and Knox were definitely hoping to take a different approach. We're going to see that doesn't quite work out, but they're definitely hoping to take a different approach. So what ends up happening is Washington decides, according to the Constitution, he has the power to make treaties with foreign nations, and he basically sees the Native American population as almost a foreign entity. And so he decides he wants to use his treaty power to try to resolve some of the issues that are present with Native Americans. And just keep in mind, the president can kind of negotiate for a treaty, but the Senate still has to approve that treaty with 2/3 of a vote for it to go into effect. But again, out in that Ohio area, these clashes are just becoming worse with Native Americans. It's going to end up leading in 1794 to the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This is actually going to be the last major conflict of the Northwest Territory between Native Americans and the United States. It takes place in present-day Ohio. The general for the Americans is General Anthony Wayne, and he's basically going to take U.S. troops into Ohio to fight against the Native American tribes that are located there. Chief Little Turtle is the head of the Miami tribe that's located in Ohio. And it's going to be that Miami tribe with the Shawnees who are going to clash with the American military. That battle is going to end in a victory for the Americans, and it's going to end with the peace treaty of Greenville that's going to be signed. And basically, and that's going to be signed the following year in 1795. But basically, with that treaty, it's going to end the hostilities between our government and the Miamis and the Shawnees in that Ohio area. But we're also going to see that the Native Americans who are living there are going to end up giving up what we know today as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. So all of that land that used to belong to Native Americans because of this Treaty of Greenville is now going to belong to the Americans. And again, that's going to just keep pushing us further west. And this is going to be a constant thing we're going to see throughout U.S. history, that we keep pushing Native Americans further and further west, and then we go to where we just push them. So these conflicts with Native Americans, even though I'm saying like the Treaty of Greenville is kind of ending it, it's ending it only in that Ohio area. We're going to see there's going to be issues during Jackson's presidency down in present-day Georgia. We're going to see that in the central portion of our country, there's going to be issues as well moving throughout much of U.S. history. And even there's tension today when you think about our country with Native Americans, and you think back to a couple years ago when there was a whole argument about putting a pipeline that was possibly going to have to go through Native American reservations. So this is something that still, unfortunately, is plaguing our country today, our poor treatment of Native Americans and their heritage. Any questions before we kind of switch from domestic policy, and we're going to end up jumping more into foreign policy? So that'll be our interactions with foreign governments. Okay. So the main players at this time are going to be France. Britain, obviously, we just got out of a war with them. Things are going to be still a little, not great. On Facebook, it would probably be, it's complicated, that relationship with them. And then Spain as well. So these are the major countries that have been, when you think about since the colonies developed, right, these are the first ones who came really to North America to start colonizing. So these are the main players that we're going to have to deal with and try to work out some problems. So as far as France is concerned, so the French Revolution is taking place. They watched our American Revolution. They read our Declaration of Independence. It super inspired them. They end up revolting and having their own revolution in America. And that France. And that French Revolution is deeply going to divide America, because the question is, should we be helping France? Right? They came to our aid. One of the reasons we won the American Revolution is the fact that they came to support us. And so there's this big question about whether or not we should help them. And France does ask for our help. They want us to help defend their territories in the West Indies. And so we're kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place as to what we do. And this is, again, where we're going to see the development of these two political parties that are going to take force and just have completely opposite viewpoints of how to do it. So you're going to have the Federalist Party, which is going to be kind of Alexander Hamilton, in a sense, is seen as their head. And they're basically concerned about the violence of the revolution. They want to avoid war with England. We're a young country. We just got out of a war ourselves. We're in a lot of debt. Do we really want to engage in this? We're not quite prepared for it. Then you have the Democratic Republicans, who, by the way, sometimes are also known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. So if you see Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans, just know that they're interchangeable. They're the same thing. Thomas Jefferson is kind of seen as their head. And they really see the French Revolution as kind of an extension of our own fight for liberty. And they're annoyed with England because England is seizing our American ships, which we're going to get into when we talk about England. And so Thomas Jefferson, he's like kind of, we really need to be supporting France during this revolution. And he gets so annoyed with our policy during the French Revolution that this is when he's going to resign as Secretary of State, because he has a lot of disagreements with Washington. He has a lot of disagreements with Hamilton over our policy towards the French. Washington, the one thing he's trying to take into consideration, if you recall way back to the American Revolution, after the Battle of Saratoga, which is seen as a turning point in our American Revolution, we signed an alliance with France. It was known as the Franco-American Alliance, and basically it said that they were going to come and support us during the American Revolution. And so France at this point in time is saying to Washington, hey, dude, you signed this alliance, which means you need to get over here and you need to help us. And Washington's basically saying, we were a completely different government. We had a different way, right? That was the Articles of Confederation. It's not the Constitution. So that agreement with you all is kind of null and void. You can't go back and say we have this agreement because we're a completely different country at this point in time. So what Washington is going to do, he's going to issue the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. And basically the Proclamation of Neutrality is saying we're staying neutral. We don't want to get involved. And it's interesting because you're going to see we're going to have, again, this is kind of another precedent he's setting in a sense. We're going to see presidents moving forward who also are going to use neutrality first before getting involved in skirmishes, which we don't necessarily do a lot today, but we did a lot back then. Our neutrality, though, is going to be tested. So the French minister to the United States, his name is Citizen Edmond Guenet. And basically, he comes here to the United States, and it's almost like he's going on a tour of the United States, and he's doing speaking engagements, and he's kind of just traveling around the U.S. But when he's doing it, he's trying to convince the American public to throw their support behind supporting France, thinking if I can get the American public to support France, they're going to get on their politicians to support France. A lot of people, especially the Federalists, they're going to kind of see this as violating the rules of diplomacy, like, hey, that's kind of shady to do. Think of this in the sense of it would almost be like if our Secretary of State today went to another country and was trying to get that country to support us in a war against someone else, right? That's kind of shady. You're not supposed to do that. So anyway, Citizen Guenet ends up being condemned. Even France is like, dude, you're overstepping yourself there. You shouldn't be doing that. They tell him, you got to come back to France. Like, you're done over there in the U.S. And he ends up like just quitting his job and chilling here in the U.S. and living here like as a private person because he doesn't want to go back to France. But the whole point is by trying to rile up people here in the U.S., it's in a sense testing our neutrality, because we're like, now people are starting to say, should we be supporting France? And it's just putting people on edge. In the end, we don't really get involved over there. As far as England is concerned, so England is causing like a lot of headaches for us at this point in time. One of the things they're doing is it's known as impressment, but they're basically impressing our sailors. So all of our trading vessels that are out to sea, what the English will do is they'll actually stop, the English Navy will stop our ships. And these are trading vessels. So these aren't even like our military ships. These are just dudes like working their jobs, bringing goods to other countries. They'll stop our ships, they'll board our ships, and then they'll basically impress or force the sailors on our ships into the British Navy. They'll try to claim, oh, you're actually a British citizen, you have to join the Navy. But they're forcing our Americans into the British Navy. So Americans are getting up in arms about that, and they want Washington to do something to stop that. They're also annoyed with the British because the British still have forts in the Northwest territory of our country. So they were supposed to, according to the Peace Treaty of Paris, they were supposed to abandon these forts after the war came to an end. They didn't. And not only did they not abandon the forts, so they're still hanging out there, but they also started arming Native Americans with weapons who are living out there. So the British are selling these weapons to Native Americans. Native Americans, yeah, exactly, Landon, bad British. Native Americans, in turn, are using those weapons on the Americans. And, in a sense, like bad British, but like they're being spiteful. It's a way to get revenge. And they're also testing like the power of our government. So we have to do something. So what Washington does is he sends our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, to go negotiate a treaty with England. You don't see nowadays our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court getting sent to do stuff like that. Usually that falls to like the State Department or the Department of Defense. But again, he didn't have a lot of advisors around, so he sends John Jay to go over to England. And John Jay is going to negotiate what's known as Jay's Treaty, unique name there. This is going to be in 1794. And basically, in this treaty, the British agreed to leave the forts on the frontier. So what they were supposed to do in the Peace Treaty of 1783, they're now saying, okay, yeah, we'll actually do that. And they also said that, but the big thing that people complained about was there's nothing about impressment in this treaty, right? So there were two things Americans were annoyed with: impressing of sailors and the forts in the northwest. So they're supposedly going to leave the forts now, but it says nothing about impressment of sailors. So Americans, when they come back, the Jeffersonian Republicans hate this treaty. They're like, you did nothing about impressment. Like, come on, like, you need to be stronger against England. But in the long run, for at least now, it does keep us neutral. We don't get into another war with Britain. But, another but, you're going to see that impressment issue that Jay's Treaty does not solve, it's going to become an issue in a few years again. And that's what's going to end up being one of the reasons that's going to pull us into the War of 1812 with Britain. So it kind of keeps things at a steady pace right now. We stay neutral because of Jay's Treaty, but things are going to ramp back up, and that's going to drag us into the war later on. And then as far as Spain is concerned, so Spain was also being a little bit shady here. Our farmers who are living in the Northwest, what they like to do, because it was easier for them to do, they like to take all the goods, all the stuff they're growing, all their different crops, ship it down the Mississippi River, and then get it to the port of New Orleans, and then put it on a boat that way to get out to the Atlantic Ocean. It was actually cheaper and easier to ship it down the Mississippi than like to horse and buggy it, right, all the way out to the East Coast to the Atlantic Ocean that way. So Spain, they have control of New Orleans. They have control of the Mississippi River. So they block the Mississippi River and don't allow the Americans to use it. And they also shut down the port of New Orleans and don't allow the Americans to use it. But Spain decides that, and they're doing this for a while, right? They're really tough. They're like, we got this, we've got the Americans, this and that. But then when we start talking to the British for Jay's Treaty, it actually gets Spain nervous. And Spain's like, we can't have the Americans and the British becoming buddy-buddy. We need to get in on this. And so there's going to be Pinckney's Treaty, which is going to be in 1795. And basically what this treaty says is Spain is going to allow us to use the Mississippi River. We're going to be allowed to use the port of New Orleans. And so this is going to be huge for farmers who are living on the frontier, because it's going to make their lives 10 times easier. It's going to cut down their costs for shipping their goods. And Pinckney's Treaty also made the northern border of Florida at the 31st parallel, because Spain at this point in time is still in control of what we know today as Florida. So if you think of the Florida-Georgia line today, that border, also Great Country Band, that comes out of Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. Questions about any of this before we move on to the next slide? All right, let's see. Let me just pull up our slides here. So Washington's farewell address is very, very interesting. He delivered it in the newspaper, right? It was just printed in the newspaper, so it's not actually a speech that he gets up and reads to the public. Nowadays, we'll see our presidents presented either in the Oval Office and it's recorded. When radios first came out, presidents were presented over the radio. Some presidents will do it in a bigger speech so the public can see it in person, but then also obviously watch it on the TV, listening to on the radio, or all of our social media that's out there today. But back in this time, there wasn't much as far as communication. So Washington has it printed in the newspapers. It's going to be in 1796 that we're going to see this printed. And in it, he warns our country about a couple different things. And so this quote that's here on the slide: political parties are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. So remember, George Washington, he doesn't belong to a political party, and here he is warning about political parties and basically saying that political parties are going to be the downfall of our country. You know, he's been watching Hamilton and Jefferson, go at it now all this time, and he's like, this is going to be a bad thing for our country. And it's funny, right? We're in 2019, and when you think of some of the drama that is caused by political parties do good things. I don't want to be totally like shutting them down here. But when you think about the drama that is caused by political parties, right? It's like, hey, George Washington, you were quite wise back in 1796 to foresee what was coming. Another area where he was wise was he also warns about permanent alliances. He refers to them as entangling foreign alliances. And he basically says how, yes, it's important that you establish good relations with foreign countries, but you should never establish relations so much that your relationship will pull you into a war that you don't need to be involved in. And if you have taken world history, I know at my school, it's juniors who take APUS, so they had world history their first 2 years. If you've taken world history, think about World War I, right? It was like a domino effect because of entangling alliances of countries being pulled into that war. And there was George Washington again in 1796 warning about the problem of these foreign alliances and how it could be a bad thing. So for someone who was from so long ago, however it was, he really had the right idea about things that were going to befall our country, and the things that we need to look out for. Not, obviously, we haven't taken heed of any of his advice, but really important. Yeah, exactly. We should listen to this man. We should make copies of his speech and put it everywhere. It's funny, a couple years ago, the Senate actually did a live one day where they all took turns reciting his different parts of his speech. And it's like, clearly you weren't listening to everything that you were saying there. But so that's Washington's farewell address. If you ever have the chance, it's short. It's not as long as the farewell addresses you'll see today. But it's definitely something to check out. And also, this is kind of the final precedent in a sense that he sets, because nowhere does it say he has to do a farewell address, but we've seen all presidents since him do farewell addresses. So that's it as far as information on Washington's presidency. I have practice multiple choice questions for us to delve in together about everything we covered. But before I do that, I just want to make sure there's any questions I could possibly answer about his presidency that I might not have, or at some point I was talking too fast and something needs to be clarified, whatever it might be. Otherwise, we have these fun, I think I have about 3 or 4 of these fun multiple choice questions for us to take a peek-see at. All right, so let's take a look. So multiple choice questions on went to the first question by mistake. Multiple choice questions on the AP exam are notorious for these long passages that you have to read, but then they're tied to about 3 or 4 questions. And the way the AP exam breaks down is like you have about a minute per question. So you want to make the most use of your time when you're reading these passages as best as you can. The most important thing to do before you even read the passage is to look at any information they might give you about that passage. So once it was about to go down. Once that goes down, we want to look at the bottom of the screen there to see who wrote the passage, the year it was written, any information that they might give you. So we know that this was written by George Washington to his Supreme Court justices in the year 1793. And so the important thing to do, because when you're taking right now, if you're taking a period 3 test, you can get in your head the context of what was going on in period 3. But when you're taking that AP exam in the spring, you're going to have dates from all over coming at your face. And if you just jump in and read the passage, you might not get the context of what that person might be talking about. So what you want to do is think about, okay, what was going on in 1793 that George Washington might be writing to his Supreme Court justices about, right? You want to get in the context of your head, the things that are going through George Washington's presidency. You know, at this point in time, we're going into his second term of office. You know, what might possibly be happening that he could be writing about. So take a second, read this passage. Hopefully it's big enough that you all can see it, or maybe you can make it bigger on your screens. But definitely read the passage, and then we'll jump right into the questions so you can see those questions. All right, so let's take a look about what he might be writing about here. So the first question, the executive departments in the passage are most likely, and let me see if I can do this poll-wise so we don't shout out answers and we can see, poll your audience. So let me create a poll here. What's your question? So the question's going to be, and to answer this, and your choices are going to be A, B, C, and then D. So create a poll. So let's take this poll. Hopefully, can you all see it? And vote for what you think is the correct answer. So what is he talking about when he's saying the executive department? So Washington's cabinet, Congress, my poll thing is blocking. Anti-Federalists, members, I think it says, sorry, the poll is blocking it. Members of the Federalist Party. So vote on what you all think the answer might be. So yeah, the correct answer is A. So definitely executive departments. Remember, it's Madison who gives that fancy name for cabinet, but in our Constitution, it's really referred to as the executive departments. Awesome. Next question. Let me see. I got to toggle back and forth here. So the passage could be used later to provide support for which of the following? The formation of political parties, the debate over which branch has the power to decide the constitutionality of laws, the nullification of federal power by state governments, or the creation of the Judiciary Act. And so I'm going to just do same thing, another poll, answer for question 2. And we'll just put all the answers down. And I can jump back to the passage right after this too, so that way you can reread the passage and see if that helps you out as well as far as answering this question. So that's the poll, and then we'll just jump back to the original passage. So again, think about what it could be used to provide support for. You probably need to see the answer choices again. So again, so that passage that the Supreme Court justices are writing to Washington, are they talking about the formation of political parties, the debates over which branch has the power to decide the constitutionality of laws, the nullification of federal power by state governments, or the creation of the Judiciary Act? Oh, we got a smart group in here. Awesome. So we got 5 people going for B, which is true. Yeah, that's exactly what this is talking about. The debates over who has, which branch has the power, because they're talking about the separation of powers there. Very cool. I think this is the last one that goes for this passage. So Washington's Proclamation of Neutrality prompted this response from the justices. Which of the following events would Washington's question most likely been about? The war between Britain and France, the Whiskey Rebellion, Adams' decision to appoint midnight judges, or the economic plan proposed by Alexander Hamilton? So again, this is in 1793 that the Supreme Court judges are responding to something that Washington had sent them. So what do you think that Washington might have been talking about? Let me get my little poll up here again. Let's see, create a poll. Question 3. Do A, B, C, D. We're going to add those. So think about what was going on in 1793 that might have been So we got 2 of you who have voted so far, and you are correct. It is talking about that war that's taking place between Britain and France and what the response should be on our end. So awesome. You guys are acing APUSH so far. Nice work. Oh, here's the famous farewell address. I forgot that I had thrown this in. So take a second, read over this farewell address, and then we're going to be jumping into a bunch of questions. First, imagine like if people still spoke like this today, right? Like sometimes when you're reading some of these texts from way back when, it's like, I don't hear any politicians speaking like this today. And that's both from the Republican and Democratic Party. I'm not trying to make any comments there. But which of the following demonstrates that Washington's attempts at avoiding passionate attachments still produce significant internal tensions? Would it be Native Americans' conflict in the Ohio Valley, negotiations over access to the Mississippi River, the rising conflict between the political parties over honoring American commitments to France from the American Revolution, or the attempts to honor the Treaty of Paris of 1783? Okay, so we got 3 people voting for C. Awesome, and that's definitely going to be the answer. So we're seeing this conflict that's taking place between the political parties. And again, something that he's warning about in his farewell address. In his farewell address, Washington alludes to which of the following constitutional conflicts? Arguments over the constitutionality of Congress creating federal courts, arguments over the constitutionality of President Washington sending troops to fight Native Americans in the Ohio Valley, arguments over the constitutionality of negotiating with Spain over access to the Mississippi River, or arguments over the constitutionality of the creation of the National Bank. We're just going to jump back here so you can take a look at this again. This one might be a little bit more tricky. The question itself. So which constitutional conflict is he alluding to? Yeah, it is going to be D. Again, he's kind of talking here about, factions, political parties, and we're going to see that the National Bank is going to be another thing that's going to tear apart with the federal political parties, where the Federalists are going to be very much for a national bank. And then you're going to have those Jeffersonian Republicans or Democrat Republicans who are going to be very much against national bank. So in his farewell address, so kind of like similar to, so we talked about for the question prior to it, we talked about the fact that when he's talking about passionate attachments, it referred to the conflict that's taking place between the political parties over France and whether or not we should get involved. So this is kind of going on a similar vein. So what you want to think about is what other arguments were really tearing at the political parties and causing those passionate attachments, even though they don't use passionate attachments again in this question, knowing that the first one focused on the angst between political parties, use that common theme in this second question. And so when we look at all the different things, all the different options, where we saw the angst between political parties, again at this time, is going to be arguments over the bank. Political parties weren't really arguing over the treatment of Native Americans. They weren't really arguing over the Mississippi River or the constitutionality of Congress creating federal courts. That's actually an area, those 3 things they actually all agreed about. Where we saw the biggest fight with political parties, though, is going to come down to Alexander Hamilton's idea to create the national bank, where you're going to have Hamilton and the Federalists being like, yes, the necessary and proper clause gives us the permission to create that bank. And then you're going to have Jefferson and those Jeffersonian Republicans saying, no, the bank is unconstitutional. Show me in the Constitution where it says that Congress can create a bank. And so then that's why the answer would be D, because he's so focused on how political parties in his farewell address are a bad thing, and it's going to lead to more fighting in our country, and that's exemplified in the national bank.